November 14th, 1942. 2,300 hours. The waters north of Guadalcanal were black as ink, no moon, no horizon, no sound, but the slow churn of propellers beneath the sea. Inside the radar room of USS Washington, a green glow pulsed across the screens. 9 blips, 9 Japanese warships, 18,000 yards away and closing. The men watching those screens could see what no human eye could shape in the darkness, moving, unaware they were being hunted. Every sweep of the antenna refreshed their position. Every rotation brought death a little closer. Above deck, there was nothing to see. Just the Pacific night and the faint smell of oil drifting from Iron Bottom Sound, a graveyard of American ships sunk 3 nights earlier. The sailors knew the names: San Francisco, Atlanta, Juneau. 706 men lost. They could still smell the fuel. Some said they could still hear the screams, but tonight would be different, because Washington was not blind. Deep in her, superstructure, humming beneath the deck plates, 2 pieces of machinery were about to change naval warfare forever: the SG surface search radar and the Mark III fire control radar. Together, they could do something no battleship in history had ever done: fight in total darkness and win. For 16 months, the men of Washington had trained with this technology. They could track a destroyer by its wake, plot a firing solution before the enemy even knew they were there. But it had never been used in combat. No admiral had dared to trust it. Most of the U.S. Navy still believed radar was a gimmick, an experiment, not a weapon. The real Navy men, the ones who believed in tradition, said battleships were finished. Floating antiques, good only for escorting aircraft carriers, the new queens of the sea. Official doctrine was clear: never risk a battleship in surface combat. The Japanese ruled the night, the Americans ruled the day. But that night off Guadalcanal, doctrine didn't matter. There were no carriers left to protect. The Marines ashore were outnumbered and surrounded. If Henderson Field fell, the Pacific offensive would die before it began. So one admiral, a quiet, unassuming Kentuckian named Willis Augustus Lee, was told to do what the textbooks forbade: take 2 battleships, sail into enemy waters, and stop the Japanese fleet alone. What followed would be the most violent surface action of the entire Pacific War, a duel fought in darkness, guided only by invisible waves of radar and the instincts of one man who understood its power. A night when 3,700 Americans faced 14 Japanese warships and 1 battleship would fight alone, outnumbered 14-1, and win. But before victory came, the sea would burn again, and the U.S. Navy would learn that the future had arrived in the flicker of a radar screen. Before Washington ever fired a shot, the United States Navy had already lost faith in her kind. Since Pearl Harbor, admirals had whispered the Dushu, same phrase like gospel: the age of the battleship is over. Carriers now ruled the sea. Battleships were reduced to bodyguard screens of armor, meant to throw flak into the sky and die before a carrier did. It wasn't cowardice. It was doctrine written in classrooms, tested in war games, and followed like religion. And in November of 1942, that doctrine was about to get men killed. 3 nights before Washington entered Iron Bottom Sound, another American force had sailed those same waters. Task Force 67, led by Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan. He had no radar-equipped battleships, no heavy armor, no night-fighting experience, just cruisers, destroyers, and courage. The Japanese came at them out of the dark Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe's bombardment group, armed with 2 battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, a heavy cruiser, and a pack of destroyers. What followed wasn't strategy. It was slaughter. Searchlights flared, gunfire flashed across the Black Sea, ships shot at, shadows, and at each other. Atlanta was torn apart by friendly fire. San Francisco's bridge was blown open by a 14-inch shell. When the night was over, Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott were both dead. 4 American destroyers were gone, 2 cruisers crippled, and 706 sailors never came home. The Japanese lost only 2 destroyers. Hiei was crippled, yes, but the enemy still owned the night. To the Marines on Guadalcanal, it felt like the end. Henderson Field, the one thing keeping them alive, was bombarded every night. Each shell that landed on that airfield meant another hole in the thin line between survival and surrender. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz read the after-action reports with grim disbelief. The situation was collapsing. Guadalcanal was supposed to be America's first offensive. Instead, it was turning into a funeral. And now, intelligence said the Japanese were coming again, a stronger force, led by Admiral Nobutake Kondo, with the battleship Kirishima and 4 heavy cruisers. Their mission was simple: flatten Henderson Field, land 11,000 fresh troops, wipe out the Marines. If they succeeded, the entire Pacific campaign would unravel. Every manual said battleships couldn't fight without carriers. But there was no time to wait. The carrier Enterprise was crippled, operating on a patched flight deck, her squadrons too depleted to help, so Nimitz did something no admiral at the War College would have dared. He threw out the doctrine. He ordered Admiral William Bull Halsey to release the battleships. No air cover, no escort carriers, no retreat. Washington and South Dakota would go in alone to fight the Japanese in their own element, in darkness, at knife range. It was a gamble no textbook could justify. But if they failed, Guadalcanal would fall. That night, the last word in naval warfare wouldn't come from an admiral's manual. It would come from the man who understood that radar could turn the night into daylight. A man who didn't look like a warrior at all. When sailors first met Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, they often mistook him for the ship's chaplain. He was short, round-shouldered, always wearing glasses that slipped down his nose. His uniform never fit quite right. His Kentucky drawl was so soft you had to lean in to catch the words. He didn't look like a warrior, but the men who served under him soon learned looks could lie. Willis Lee was a marksman of almost supernatural precision. In 1920, he went to the Olympics in Antwerp and came back with 7 medals, 5 gold, 2 silver. He could fire 10 rounds through a single bullet hole at 1,000 yards. To him, shooting wasn't math, it was music. He felt the rhythm of distance and speed, the invisible dance between the bullet and the wind. Now, 2 decades later, Lee had traded rifles for 16-inch naval guns, and his orchestra was the USS Washington. When radar arrived in the fleet, most officers saw it as a gadget, something to help spot planes, maybe a parlor trick to track weather. Lee saw it for what it really was: the future. A way to see through darkness, through smoke, through chaos itself. He spent months tearing apart Washington's procedures, rebuilding them around radar. Where others relied on lookouts and shouted reports, Lee wired his radar operators directly to the gunnery officer. No middlemen, no confusion. Every bearing, every range, every target real-time. It was revolutionary, and to the traditionalists, it was heresy. Old-school admirals called him reckless. They said radar would fail when it mattered most, that no machine could replace the human eye. Lee didn't argue, he just drilled harder. Day after day, the men of Washington practiced what no one else dared: radar-directed gunnery, target tracking in total darkness, live fire exercises guided by blips instead of binoculars. Lee's crews could hit a destroyer-sized target. They couldn't even see. When the Navy brass complained about wasted ammunition, Lee paid out of his own pocket for more practice shells. He didn't care about doctrine, he cared about results. By November 1942, Washington's radar system had become an extension of Lee himself. He could read those glowing screens like a pianist reads notes. He understood what they meant before the operators spoke. That connection between man and machine was about to be tested, because now he had orders that went against everything the Navy had taught him. Sail into enemy waters at night with untested radar against Japan's best night-fighting fleet. Lee didn't flinch. He gathered his officers in the wardroom, his voice calm as ever. "We're not here to die," he said. "We're here to make the enemy die, and we're going to do it before he even sees us." To the men listening, it sounded like madness, but to Lee, it was simple physics and faith. Faith in his crew, faith in his ship, faith in the cold green pulse of a radar screen. That faith would soon face its first and only trial in the most haunted waters on Earth. The evening sky over Guadalcanal was streaked in crimson as the sun vanished behind Savo Island. Beneath that fading light, 6 American ships formed a column and turned toward waters already soaked in blood. At the front steamed 4 destroyers, Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwyn. Behind them loomed 2 giants, the battleships Washington and South Dakota. Together, they formed Task Force 64. On paper, it looked formidable. In reality, it was a hastily assembled team that had never fought together or even practiced as a unit. South Dakota had just limped out of repairs from bomb damage at Santa Cruz. Half her crew had never been in combat. Her radios used different frequencies than Washington's. Their recognition signals didn't match. Even their navigation lights operated on different circuits. Lee didn't learn that until they were already at sea. He had to improvise jury-rigging, a system of pre-arranged maneuvers and signal lamps. If the Japanese appeared, one mistake in communication could doom them all. By dusk, the destroyer captains could see the twisted silhouettes of wreckage from the previous battle. Masts broke the surface like skeletal fingers. Oil slicks glistened in the twilight. Every man on deck knew what that meant. Those were American ships, their friends, their classmates, their ghosts. The sea around Savo Island had earned a name whispered with dread iron-bottom sound. Dozens of ships already lay on its floor, but there was no turning back. Admiral Lee stood on Washington's bridge, calm, almost still. He watched the radar scope, a green horizon that showed the future in flickers. His operators adjusted their dials. Echoes appeared, faint, distant, moving fast. At 22:52 hours contact, bearing 090, range 18,000 yards. Enemy ships, destroyers, scouts for a much larger force. Every instinct screamed to open fire. Lee could have unleashed Washington's 16-inch guns right then and obliterated those lead ships before the Japanese even knew he was there. But he didn't. He waited, because Lee understood something his enemies didn't, the human mind's weakness for expectation. The Japanese weren't looking for American battleships. They were expecting aircraft, maybe submarines, perhaps PT boats. Anything but this. He decided to let them come closer, far closer than any textbook would allow. It was a terrible gamble. The longer he waited, the greater the risk. If the Japanese lookouts spotted even one American mast, they would unleash their deadly Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, each capable of splitting a cruiser in half. Washington's radar operators whispered range updates: 16,000 yards, 14,000, 12,000. Men on the bridge could hear their own heartbeats. 10,000 yards. At this range, the Japanese should have seen them, but their lookouts were facing Guadalcanal, watching for air attacks from Henderson Field, not for an ambush from the rear. 8,000 yards. Lee gave the order, "Open fire." Washington's main guns roared, 9 16-inch rifles, each one hurling a 2,700-pound shell through the dark. The shockwave rippled across the sea. 23 seconds later, massive water columns erupted around the Japanese cruiser Sendai. They'd missed, but barely. The second salvo corrected. A Japanese destroyer, Ayanami, took a direct hit. One shell tore through her thin hull and detonated in her engine room. The explosion split her in two. All at once, the night lit up with fire. South Dakota joined in, her guns flashing white and orange against the Black Sea. The American destroyers surged forward, launching torpedoes. The Japanese responded instantly, flares, star shells, searchlights. Within seconds, the darkness vanished, replaced by a flickering inferno of light and thunder. Shells screamed across the water. Torpedoes sliced phosphorescent wakes toward unseen shapes. Every ship fired at something, sometimes friend, sometimes foe. It was Callahan's nightmare all over again, except this time the Americans had radar. And then disaster struck. At 23:37, a technician aboard South Dakota tried to fix a minor fault in the ship's electrical system. He threw the wrong switch. The main circuit breakers tripped. Every light went out. Every radar screen went black. Gun directors froze. Elevators jammed. In an instant, one of America's most powerful battleships was blind, deaf, and defenseless. Searchlights from Kirishima and her escort cruisers locked onto her silhouette. The Japanese opened fire. 14-inch shells tore into South Dakota's superstructure. 8-inch rounds from Otago and Takao shredded her decks. In less than 90 seconds, she was hit 27 times. Smoke, flame, screams, chaos. And through that chaos, Admiral Lee watched from Washington's bridge. His radar still worked. He could see what no one else could, a battlefield dissolving into fragments. And in that confusion, Lee saw an opening. From Washington's radar room came a calm voice that cut through the chaos. Multiple targets scattering, main enemy force turning southeast. Kirishima, range 8,400 yards. Admiral Lee looked at the glowing green blips and made his choice. Every principle of naval warfare said retreat. Every manual said, "You're outnumbered 14-1, get out." But Lee wasn't reading a manual. He was reading the sea. The Japanese were in total disarray, their formation shattered by their own aggression. They had fixated on South Dakota, the crippled battleship burning on the horizon. Not one of them had noticed Washington, hidden in the shadows behind the wrecks of the American destroyers. Lee saw an opportunity that might never come again. He turned to his gunnery officer. "Lock Kirishima. All batteries. Fire when ready." Washington accelerated 26 knots, plowing straight toward the enemy fleet. No lights, no radio, just radar, a ghost in the night. Then, 9 16-inch rifles thundered. Each gun spat a 2,700-pound shell, streaking unseen through the darkness at 2,300 feet per second. The first salvo straddled Kirishima. The second found her. The sea erupted. Shells punched through her armor, exploded deep inside her hull. One destroyed her forward turret, killing everyone inside. Another smashed her steering gear, locking her rudder hard to port. A third tore through her engine room. Inside Kirishima, it was chaos, men shouting, steam hissing, the deck tilting beneath their boots. Captain Iwabuchi Sanji, blood running down his face, refused to leave the bridge. He shouted orders, but the ship no longer obeyed. Washington's radar-guided guns were relentless. In 7 minutes, she fired 75 shells from her main battery and over 100 from her 5-inch secondaries. Every hit tore Kirishima apart. Her pagoda mast, that towering structure atop her bridge, collapsed in a tangle of fire and steel. Her decks were ablaze. Ammunition detonated below. A battleship that had once bombarded Pearl Harbor was now circling helplessly in her own flames. Admiral Kondo, watching his flagship burn, couldn't comprehend what was happening. To him, it felt impossible. No fleet could fire that accurately, that fast, in the dark. He thought he was facing multiple American battleships, but it was only one, Washington. Lee's voice was quiet but steady. "Shift fire to Otago and Takao." The guns roared again. Salvos crashed around the Japanese cruisers, geysers of seawater drenching their bridges. The enemy responded in panic, launching 16 long-lance torpedoes in a desperate spread. But radar was still Lee's invisible weapon. Washington's operators tracked the incoming wakes, plotting their paths in real time. Lee turned hard to starboard, ordering flank speed. The massive ship leaned into the turn, her hull shuddering, her bow cutting through black waves. Every torpedo missed, some by only yards. As Washington cleared the spread, her main battery reloaded and fired again. Each thunderous salvo echoed across Iron Bottom Sound, the last great duel of battleships on Earth. Within minutes, Admiral Kondo's fleet was broken. His cruisers turned north, his destroyers scattered in panic. The great Japanese night fighters, undefeated for 20 years, were running. At one, Kirishima was finished. Her list increased. Flooding spread from compartment to compartment. Captain Iwabuchi gave the order no Japanese captain ever wanted to give. Abandon ship. As the surviving crew gathered on the slanting deck, they sang the Japanese national anthem, a final salute to their emperor. Then they went over the side. At 3:20, Kirishima rolled over and disappeared beneath the waves northwest of Savo Island. The first battleship, sunk by another battleship in the Pacific War, destroyed by a single ship fighting alone. When Lee finally broke radio silence to avoid being attacked by friendly PT boats, his message was simple and pure. Willis Lee. This is Ching Lee. Get out of my way. I'm coming through. By dawn, the sea was quiet again. Fires still burned in the distance. Oil slicks shimmered in the first light of morning. The Japanese fleet was gone. Guadalcanal was safe. And USS Washington, the battleship that fought blind, hadn't taken a single serious hit. Dawn broke over Iron Bottom Sound like a cruel mercy. The sea was calm, as if nothing had happened, as if the previous night's inferno had been a dream. But it wasn't. The proof was everywhere, oil fires still burning, wreckage drifting, and the faint smell of cordite clinging to the breeze. USS Washington rode quietly among the debris, her paint scorched by her own gun flashes, her crew exhausted but alive. Every man aboard knew they had seen something impossible. They had watched one ship fight an entire fleet and win. The results were staggering. The Japanese bombardment force was destroyed. Kirishima lay on the ocean floor. 7 Japanese transports were caught in the open at sunrise and annihilated by aircraft from Henderson Field. Of the 11,000 troops meant to reinforce Guadalcanal, barely 4,000 reached shore, most without their equipment. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japan's night-fighting legend was broken. And with it, the myth of invincibility. The cost had been brutal. 3 American destroyers were gone, Preston, Walker, and Benham. Gwynn was limping home, her decks blackened. South Dakota was a floating ruin. More than 400 Americans were dead. But Washington, the ship that had fired the shots that saved Guadalcanal, had suffered no serious damage. Not a single man aboard had been killed or seriously wounded by enemy action. Her only scar was a single 5-inch shell that had clipped her radio antenna. It was a victory so clean, so precise, it almost felt unreal. When Admiral William Halsey received the news, he sent a personal message to Lee. You and your task force have written a glorious page in American naval history. But the Navy's official reaction was quieter. Too quiet. Because this victory, this miracle of radar, training, and initiative didn't fit the narrative. For years, the admirals had preached that battleships were obsolete, that carriers were the future. If Washington's triumph was acknowledged as revolutionary, it meant their doctrine had been wrong. So the reports were buried. The after-action summaries were filed away. The story was rewritten as a defensive success, not a technological revolution. Lee didn't complain. Publicly, he said the only thing that mattered was saving Guadalcanal and the Marines who owed their lives to it. But privately, he knew the truth. He had seen what radar could do. He had seen what properly trained crews could achieve when freed from outdated rules. And he had proven, beyond doubt, that a single battleship with the right tools and tactics could dominate the night. He wrote detailed reports, hundreds of pages, explaining how radar-directed gunnery could transform surface warfare. He called for new training, new systems, new doctrine. Most of it was ignored. Within a year, the battleships were back to carrier escort duty, firing at shorelines, guarding the flat tops, never again unleashed to hunt on their own. Lee stayed loyal. He didn't rebel. He followed orders. But each campaign, the Marianas, the Philippines, Leyte Gulf, reminded him of what could have been. Time and again, chances arose where radar-equipped battleships could have ambushed Japanese surface forces. Time and again, doctrine stopped them. By the end of the war, Lee's ideas had proven prophetic but too late. He died on August 25, 1945, just 10 days after Japan's surrender. A heart attack aboard a small launch heading to his flagship, the Wyoming, 57 years old. The Navy mourned him, but his obituary in the New York Times gave only one sentence to the battle that had defined him. The ship that had saved Guadalcanal, Washington, returned home, served quietly for 2 more years, and was eventually scrapped, sold for $544,000, melted into steel and silence. No museum, no memorial, just razor blades and rebar. And yet, the legacy endured. Every radar-guided missile system on every modern U.S. warship from Aegis cruisers to Arleigh Burke destroyers carries the DNA of Lee's revolution. Sensor integration, fire control synchronization, seeing the enemy through darkness and striking before he ever knows you're there, all born from that November night. 82 years later, most people have never heard of USS Washington. They know Missouri, where the war ended. They know Arizona, where it began. But not the ship that proved the future in the middle of it. Her story isn't just about steel and radar. It's about a truth that every generation forgets, that innovation is always strangled first by tradition. And that real revolutions rarely come from admirals in offices. They come from quiet men who see farther than anyone else, men like Willis Lee. That night off Guadalcanal, one battleship, one crew, and one idea saved the Pacific. History tried to forget them, but the ocean remembers. When the last guns fell silent over the Pacific, the great carriers took their place in museums, enshrined as the heroes of the sea. The Enterprise, the Yorktown, the Intrepid, their names became legend. But the ship that fought alone, the one that changed everything, faded into the footnotes. USS Washington had no memorial, no deck preserved for visitors, no proud tour guides retelling her night of defiance. Her steel was cut apart, melted down, and folded into the bones of another America. Highways, bridges, factories. The ship that saved Guadalcanal now lives as invisible atoms in the civilization she helped protect. And yet, her story remains. If you listen, you can still hear the echo of her guns across Iron Bottom Sound, where her enemy sleeps beside her. The sea that swallowed both friend and foe is quiet now, but every sonar ping that maps its depths tells a silent truth. She was here, and she won. For all her power, Washington's true weapon wasn't her 16-inch guns, or her armor, or her engines. It was the mind of the man who commanded her. Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, the unassuming Kentuckian with the slouched shoulders and the rifleman's patience, saw what others refused to see. That technology, when joined with training and trust, could rewrite the laws of war. He didn't just command a ship. He orchestrated a symphony of steel, radar, and human precision. And in one night, he proved that knowledge, not numbers, decides battles. Lee's ideas outlived him. Every modern destroyer and cruiser in the U.S. Navy still follows his blueprint. See farther, strike faster, and never wait for permission when the moment comes. His legacy sails in every fleet that fights through clouds, darkness, and electronic silence. But the man himself and the ship that made it possible are almost forgotten. That's the cruel irony of history. The revolutionaries who change everything are rarely celebrated by the institutions they save. In 1942, Lee's victory challenged the Navy's orthodoxy so deeply that it was buried beneath bureaucratic embarrassment. It took decades for historians to uncover the full scope of what he'd achieved. Even now, most people know Guadalcanal for the Marines, not for the battleship that made their victory possible. But on that November night, in the black waters north of the island, Washington stood between defeat and survival and didn't flinch. One ship against 14, blind fire guided only by faith in a new science. And when the smoke cleared, she hadn't lost a single man. That doesn't happen by luck. It happens when leadership meets preparation, when innovation meets courage. History calls her the battleship that fought alone. But she didn't really fight alone. She fought with every Marine who held Henderson Field, with every pilot who flew from its cratered runway, with every sailor who'd gone down 3 nights earlier in those same waters. She fought for all of them, and for the idea that the impossible is sometimes just what hasn't been tried yet. Today, when satellites track enemies from orbit, when warships fight across invisible horizons, when victory is decided by who sees first, all of it began with that glowing green radar screen on Washington. That night was more than a battle. It was a glimpse of the future one that arrived too soon for the world to understand. 82 years later, the sea still keeps her secret. But for those who know, who remember, who still care, her name will always mean one thing: courage, guided by clarity, technology in the hands of faith, and a ship that refused to die quietly. If you believe the story of Washington deserves to be remembered, if you think Admiral Lee and his crew earned their place among history's giants, share their story. Because remembrance is victory's only afterlife. And this is the story of the battleship that fought alone and won.